Welcome to the Real News Network, coming to you from the McClatchy newspaper offices in Washington, D.C. We're now joined by Jonathan Landay, who's McClatchy newspaper's national security and intelligence analyst and reporter. He's spent 23 years covering Afghanistan, and he just returned from the most recent trip to Afghanistan just a few weeks ago. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, Jonathan, what do people in Afghanistan, first of all, Afghans, and you spent a lot of time with American soldiers, what do they think of what the Obama administration seems to have planned, which is more troops?
There are they're kind of conflicted. On the one hand, there's a great deal of apprehension that more troops means more violence, which means more civilian casualties. And a lot of people are extremely alarmed by that prospect. The number of civilian casualties caused in U.S. military operations is a huge issue there, in part because it's been used by President Karzai to advance his own prospects for re-election. He thinks it's an issue that resonates. And it's an issue that is one that's kind of taken somewhat out of context, in that the Taliban are responsible for far more civilian deaths than U.S.-led NATO forces are. However, because of the emphasis that this issue has been given by the leadership in Afghanistan, and because it is a real issue, 8 years after the initial U.S. intervention there, it is something that really resonates, and people are concerned. But on the other hand, I think a lot of Afghans will see the increase in U.S. troops as confirmation that, in fact, the United States really is committed to trying to bring stability to Afghanistan after 8 years of basically failed policy. Basically, this has been a war that's been run on the cheap. It's what the military refers to as an economy of force operation, in that all of the resources, all the attention, all of the energy have really gone into Iraq, whereas whatever can be spared after that has gone into Afghanistan. And it's not been enough. It's been totally inadequate, and it's a major reason why after 8 years of international intervention, the Taliban are in resurgence.
Both of us were in Afghanistan in the spring of 2002. Now, you've been there many more times than I have. But in the spring of 2002, I found people, Afghans, ready for reconstruction. I traveled from the north to the south. The one demand I heard was schools, hospitals, some kind of employment, and the thing I heard almost more than that was disarm the warlords, which I heard over and over again. There was an opportunity there for a rebuilding of Afghanistan that people would have welcomed. From the current policy we're hearing from the Obama administration, it sounds like it's still all about the military.
Well, we haven't actually heard the strategy yet. That's still being worked on. But in fact, there is word today that part of the strategy is going to involve what is being called a civilian surge into Afghanistan. There's going to be a large number of diplomats who are going to go in, but more importantly, there are going to be more civilian experts at reconstruction, at road building, at agriculture, on all of the issues that really haven't been addressed, that need to be addressed, that the military itself really is not adequately structured to do. For instance, on this last trip, I was embedded with U.S. troops, and they had officers whose job is to fire artillery and decimate the enemy, doing urban reconstruction projects, trying to figure out how they restart sanitation collections in the town that I was in, how they repave the bazaar, how they repair sidewalks, how they bring clean water.
Is there still time for this? That's
the question.
I mean, because there was a point where people were ready for this. Have they just decided? Have people, certainly in the countryside at least, decided that this is just a foreign occupation?
Well, it depends what part of the countryside you're talking about. The south and east, which are dominated by the Pashtun ethnic group, which is almost exclusively makes up the Taliban, are certainly, it seems, more prepared to tolerate the Taliban in their villages and providing support for the Taliban. But I still believe that most Afghans don't want the Taliban back. Not at least the way they ran the country back in the 1990s. Afghans love music. They love to dance. They like to watch particularly Indian movies. They don't want to go back to the days where all of that was banned. They don't want to go back to the days where there were public executions in soccer stadiums. And yet, because of the fact that these last 8 years have been squandered by the previous administration, and because of its misguided policies towards Pakistan, and because of Pakistan's policies, people are very much sitting on the fence in Afghanistan. As a senior NATO officer said to me, he said, this is a nation of fence sitters. Why? Because they're not convinced anymore that the United States is there to rebuild their country. They're convinced, a lot of people believe, that the United States is there to occupy their country as part of a war against Islam. One of the ironies of the U.S. involvement there is that the United States and its Western partners have helped engender a unprecedented amount of media freedom in Afghanistan. They have independent newspapers, independent radio, independent television, which they never had before. That's great. But what all of this has done has brought the world to Afghanistan in a way that has never been brought to Afghanistan before. So the Afghan people see Abu Ghraib. They see Guantanamo. They watch the Israeli assault on Gaza. And this in fact helps reinforce this misimpression that the United States is there as part of to occupy their country as part of a war against Islam. So you have a nation of fence sitters. What has to happen is steps must be taken to reassure those people, to reclaim public confidence that the United States is there to try and rebuild their country and prevent it from reverting back to an al-Qaeda stronghold. And then we'll get out. If they are not convinced of that, if more people become convinced that the United States is there to occupy that country, then you will have people jumping off that fence onto the Taliban side of the fence, not because they love the Taliban, but because they are convinced that we are there as a foreign occupier.
The language we're hearing from the Obama administration, so far at least, and as you say, we haven't heard the whole articulation of the policy yet, is that the objective now seems to be just to make sure that Afghanistan is not a base for terrorism, a base for al-Qaeda. Not an objective of how do we do something for the Afghan people. If you remember after the initial invasion, President Bush said we're going to have something like a Marshall Plan.
Right.
I think we heard it once and never heard it again.
He called for a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan. He actually used those words.
And President Obama, during the election campaign for 1 week, used the word Marshall Plan for a few days during that week, and then we haven't heard that again. And there's two very different objectives here. One is just make sure there's no terrorism. The other is a Marshall Plan and actually try to do something to pay back the Afghan people for what they've suffered over the last 20 years, not 8 years.
More than that, 40 years. Since 1978, there's essentially been civil war or political instability and violence in Afghanistan. No, the fact is that you can't have one or the other in Afghanistan. You cannot pursue a campaign to prevent Afghanistan from reverting back to an al-Qaeda sanctuary if you don't do a full-blown counterinsurgency campaign which calls for reconstruction. Otherwise, how is the United States ever going to get out of Afghanistan? How is the United States ever going to ensure that Afghanistan doesn't revert back to this place that harbors al-Qaeda and is run by a fundamentalist militia movement?
Is it too late for the United States to play this role? Does this role need to be played through the UN with a UN flag? I mean,
No, because
is the U.S. not too discredited in Afghanistan?
No, because what happens, I talked about people sitting on the fence. What is the message that will be conveyed to those people if the United States turns around and says, actually, you know, all those troops we thought we were talking about sending, we're not going to send them now. You know, all of that reconstruction that we promised we were going to do, we're not going to do that now. Well, all those people are going to jump. They want to be on the winning side. If they see the United States is giving way to the United Nations, that will be tantamount to a disaster for American policy there. Look, we've already seen what happens when Afghans believe that the United States is getting ready to get out. When the United States turned over southern Afghanistan to NATO command, you saw a huge, massive increase in the Taliban resurgence in the south. Why? Because the Taliban believed that this was a prelude to the United States disengaging entirely militarily from Afghanistan. That same thing will happen on a much huger scale if the Afghan people believe that the United States now has decided to disengage.
Now, many of the NATO countries, certainly England, and you hear some of it from Canada, believe that the only real way to have any kind of step forward in Afghanistan is some kind of negotiations with the Taliban. They have to be brought into the process. What do you think of that, and is it possible?
The United States is also talking about that. My question, I have a couple questions in response. One is, which Taliban are we talking about? I've asked, who are you talking about? You talk about moderate Taliban commanders. Give me a name and give me an address. Nobody can. That's my first question. The second is, do people really believe that the Taliban is willing to negotiate, given the conditions that I described, where it's not clear which way this thing is going, but that they actually believe they're winning? Look, you've got to step back and look at this as not just Afghanistan, but Pakistan and Afghanistan. These are related insurgencies. You, in fact, call them one insurgency. You don't have a single organization, a single insurgent group pursuing this whole thing, but they're all allied. They are all working towards the same goal. And right now, the Pakistani side of this thing has gotten within 100 miles of downtown Islamabad. So why would the Taliban be interested in negotiating if they believe they're winning?
How is there any possibility of reconstruction or change in Afghanistan without taking on the narcotics industry? Which is
it's a major problem, but I believe that the first thing that needs to be done, the first thing that has to be done, is to reclaim the bulk of the Afghan people, to reclaim popular confidence that the United States is there because it wants to rebuild the country or help start rebuilding the country, put in place a government that can function, and then get out. Because if the United States loses,
but you're talking about a country which is completely imbued with narco culture.
Yeah, but you're also
at every level of government, and including many people suggest even
no doubt
in
about
sections
it.
of the American military,
Yes.
and Pakistani military.
But you're also talking about most of 30 million people who want one thing. They want security. They want what everybody else in the world wants. They want security for their families. They want to be able to have to work.
Of course, but how do you get to that?
Well,
there's been some practical proposals. Number one, buy the poppy crop, for example.
No, I don't think that will work.
Why not?
Because they will encourage everyone else in Afghanistan to grow poppy.
Farmers don't make very much from poppy, so if they all produce poppy and sell it to the UN or something, as a transition step towards some kind of real agriculture and economy? Otherwise, if people don't have jobs, how do you reclaim hearts and minds?
Well, but people can have jobs if you restart reconstruction projects on the scale that should have been started 8 years ago. You can give people. Let me give you an example. I've been going to Kabul since 1987. I don't see much of an improvement in Kabul at all since then. There are streets in Kabul that are like dirt tracks in the countryside. There are open sewers, but there is an army of unemployed men in Kabul. What if you were able to take those men and just start cleaning the sewers? Just start repairing the roads in Kabul.
It's a beginning, but you're still going to have 65-70% of GDP based on the poppy.
But yes, but you've got to start somewhere. And if you can start bringing stability, you can start talking about exploiting the huge amounts of natural resources that remain unexploited in Afghanistan: oil, natural gas, gold, copper, iron. It's exploitable, and it can be exploitable in relatively responsible ways. Plus, there are commodities in Central Asia that the Central Asians are desperate to sell. They're called oil and gas. There are a couple of countries that are absolutely desperate to have this oil and gas: India and China. the fastest way out is pipelines across Afghanistan to the Pakistani coast, to a port that's been built by China on Pakistan's coast, and then to India. All I'm saying is there is potential there. If you can find crop substitution programs, and there are crop substitution programs that work in Afghanistan. For instance, there was one in Helmand province where the bulk of the poppy is produced that substitutes wheat for poppy, and that wheat provides as much income for the farmer as the poppy does. The farmer can't grow the wheat because the Taliban won't let them. But if you can bring enough stability to parts of Afghanistan where you can actually have viable crop substitution programs.
You come back from Afghanistan optimistic?
No, I'm not saying I'm optimistic at all. In fact, as you point out, it's a question of time. The United States and its Western allies are now in a race against time. 8 years have been squandered. My question is, is there enough time to begin getting it right? I don't know the answer to that. What I'm saying is, though, that at this point, it doesn't matter because the choices are extremely clear. You can't look at Afghanistan without looking at Pakistan. This crisis is no longer about denying Al-Qaeda the ability to reclaim Afghanistan as a safe haven from which to plot attacks against the United States and the West. It's no longer, it's gone far beyond that. What this has now become is a race to prevent the dissolution and the disintegration of a nuclear-armed Pakistan. And as I said, this is an insurgency that you can't look in isolation at. It starts near the border, Afghanistan's border with Iran, in the southwest, and goes all the way across southern Afghanistan, eastern Afghanistan, across the border into Pakistan, all the way through the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan, into the northwest frontier province, and now into the Swat Valley, 100 miles from Islamabad. This has to be about preventing the collapse of Pakistan, because a failed state with nuclear weapons in South Asia is something that is a danger to the entire world.
Which is why the question will be, is there really going to be an Afghan policy that has anything to do with the reconstruction, or is this really all becoming a Pakistan policy?
This is the danger. The danger is that the dire conditions that obtain in Pakistan today could end up sucking the oxygen out of Afghan policy in terms of the diplomatic energy, the diplomatic attention, the political attention and energy that has to be paid to the entire region. I don't know that it's going to suck the oxygen out of the military effort, but the military effort is not going to get peace in Afghanistan. It's got to be a holistic approach.
Or Pakistan.
Or Pakistan, absolutely.
Well, let's continue this again soon.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.